This is Plant-Based Briefing, How Redlining Negatively Impacts Food Environments for Minorities, by Stephanie Frias at balanced.org. And I'm Marian Erickson, host of this curated content plant-based podcast, where I narrate a variety of articles on healthy, compassionate, and sustainable living with permission in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. I'm pleased to have permission to share content from Balanced. They're a network of public health professionals, nutrition science experts, and everyday people from around the world fighting for a healthier food system, one menu at a time. Their community-led campaigns and institutional support programs have influenced nutrition policy in schools, hospitals, and offices in cities around the world, impacting the healthfulness of millions of meals annually. They have great resources on their website as well if you're interested in getting some changes made in institutions where your loved ones are fed food, schools, hospitals, things like that. So now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. How Redlining Negatively Impacts Food Environments for Minorities, by Stephanie Frias at balanced.org. Growing up, accessing nutritious food was sometimes a hefty obstacle for my family. This was the unfortunate, everyday reality for our community, just as it is for many minority communities across the country. For millions of Americans, the issue of food access is complicated by multiple factors, such as race, ethnicity, location, and income. Nutrition insecurity, that is, a lack of access to nutritious food options, heavily affects marginalized groups. It's a concept that can be understood a little more clearly if we look at the history of redlining in the United States. Now, what exactly is redlining? If you haven't heard the term before, it refers to a segregative and discriminatory housing practice first performed in the 1970s, where loans and credit were withheld from predominantly non-white neighborhoods. Let's take it back to the beginning with a little history lesson. In the late 1930s, during the New Deal era, the federal government insured mortgages as a means of protecting homeowners and throwing them a lifeline amid the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was established for this purpose, and the federal government commissioned the creation of color-coded maps to dictate which areas within cities and towns would be more worthy of loans. 4 colors were used to indicate this value, which ranged from excellent prospects for investment to not desirable at all. Green represented the most desirable, blue for still desirable, yellow for declining, and red for hazardous. Many of the communities lined in red were predominantly Black and low-income neighborhoods. This rendered these communities unworthy of homeownership benefits, so residents were barred from receiving loans and mortgages. This prompted a steep economic decline within minority communities, as the government's intentional disinvestment in their infrastructure led to a lack of critical services like healthcare facilities, banks, and grocery stores. Both in intent and in practice, this color-coding technique kept minority neighborhoods from accessing quality loans because those in power saw them as unreliable recipients. To be clear, it was a deliberate policy choice by our government to further entrench poverty in these communities. But how do we know this wasn't merely unintentional? In 1938, the Federal Housing Administration published the Underwriting Manual that clearly stated their intentions when color-coding certain communities. They claimed that infiltration by inharmonious racial groups would lead to low location value ratings in white neighborhoods. They advised that this be avoided to preserve the economic value of the area and to encourage businesses to continue investing in these communities. Redlining is the term scholars have given to this intentional and discriminatory practice of keeping people of color in poverty and residentially segregated from white communities. The blatantly racist language in the very documents laying out the color-coded investment system strongly suggests that the architects of redlining understood the practice would lead to a paucity of healthcare and food retail infrastructure within predominantly Black and minority communities. The legacy of redlining has had harmful ripple effects that persist today, including those of food and nutrition insecurity within minority neighborhoods. The long-standing neglect of low-income minority communities shaped their food environments in harmful ways. Historically, redlined communities have suffered malnutrition due to a lack of economic investment and development. Supermarket chains, which offer a variety of nutritionally dense foods, often abandon low-income minority areas. Instead, they oversaturate more affluent, suburban, predominantly white neighborhoods, where there are higher-paying customers. I have personal experience with the fallout of redlining. For me, I would have to take a bus, a train, and then another train to get to my nearest Whole Foods, which is about a 40-minute commute on New York City Transit. It's the same distance to my nearest Trader Joe's. In other places like Baltimore, New York City, and Winston-Salem, the location of supermarkets corresponds with race, with Black communities having the lowest access to these stores. On the flip side, minority neighborhoods are more attractive to fast food chains and local delis since they can rely on low-wage labor. And because of the quick, cheap nature of their products, they secure low-income customers. These environments are regarded as food deserts due to their lack of nutritional and affordable food options. What other evidence is there that redlining is connected to food deserts? In 2022, over 100 urban areas across the continental United States were surveyed using census tracts to measure the relationship between the healthiness of food environments and a history of discriminatory housing segregation. The research showed that there was a direct correlation between the healthiness of a food environment and the record of redlining in a given area. In areas that were regarded as less healthy, i.e. near fast food restaurants, smaller grocery stores, and convenience stores within census tracts or 1/2 mile from the census tract boundary, data showed that these neighborhoods were more likely graded as declining or hazardous by the HOLC compared with neighborhoods graded as desirable. Racial residential segregation has led to a lack of wealth, power, and property in predominantly minority communities, resulting in unhealthy food environments and difficult access to grocery stores. When talking about communities accessing nutritious food options, it is important that we pay attention to the history of the racist, segregative housing policies that have shaped the lives of people of color to this day. Fixing these wrongs will require an investment in a food system-wide change. It will require support in the form of food banks, the work of food advocacy organizations, and even simply talking about this history with friends and family. Improving food choices for low-income people of color requires a communal effort to understand, learn, and listen to those most affected by this issue. Nutritious food is a human right that everyone deserves to enjoy, and the barriers to obtaining it need to be addressed by policymakers. You just listened to How Redlining Negatively Impacts Food Environments for Minorities by Stephanie Frias at balanced.org. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson. And as always, I put a link to the original post in the show notes, and you can see some of the references linked there, like the underwriting manual, for example, and the color-coded maps. I'll also link an article from NPR. It was a segment on fresh air from 2017, and I remembered hearing this, and I went looking for it. It says, "Today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of average white incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. The African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. At the time, African Americans were equally able to afford homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them, and they therefore didn't realize the appreciation in the income that the white families did. So the white families sent their children to college with their home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children, and the cycle continues, but none of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So we need to change our policies, our food systems. There's so much that needs to change, and I'm so grateful for organizations like Balanced, like Switch for Good, like PCRM, these organizations that are working at the policy level to make sweeping change. I also recommend the documentary They're Trying to Kill Us. It's a plant-based documentary, gets into all these types of situations, and you can find it at they'retryingtokillus.com, but I'll link that in the show notes as well. So please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.